Margarethe Weber stood in the shell of what had once been her kitchen, holding a Red Cross notification card she could barely believe was real. The typed English words, translated by a neighbor's daughter who had studied languages before the war, promised building materials. Lumber, nails, window glass, from Americans. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The same Americans whose bombs had destroyed this house 14 months earlier. The same Americans whose soldiers now patrolled her streets with rifles and authority. The same Americans she had been taught, through 4 years of Goebbels' propaganda, to fear as barbarians who would exact terrible revenge upon defeated Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Frau Weber's husband, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, had fallen at Kursk in July 1943. Her 2 sons, 17 and 19 when the war ended, had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of Germany's collapse. No notifications, no graves, just silence. She was one of approximately 1 million German war widows in West Germany by 1946, women whose husbands had fallen in 2 world wars, left to navigate a landscape of rubble and starvation, raising children in buildings that no longer had roofs, cooking meals from rations that provided barely 1,200 calories daily. The mathematics of survival seemed impossible. 3.6 million of Germany's 16 million homes had been completely destroyed. Another 4 million were damaged beyond immediate use. 80% of the nation's infrastructure required repair or reconstruction, and this was just the physical devastation. The human cost defied comprehension. Approximately 6.9 to 7.5 million Germans had died during the war. The sex ratio in occupied Germany had become catastrophically unbalanced. In some areas, particularly in the Soviet zone, there were only 63 men for every 100 women among those of prime working age. Frau Weber had watched the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, working in organized columns through the winter of 1945 into 46. She had joined them herself some days, when the cold wasn't too severe, forming human chains to pass bricks from the ruins. 9 hours of labor, 72 Reichspfennig per hour, 1 food ration card per day that could barely feed 1 person. The city of Stuttgart, where Frau Weber lived, had been struck by 53 Allied air raids between 1940 and 1945. The raids had killed approximately 4,500 civilians and destroyed roughly 60% of the city's buildings. The Baroque old town, centuries of German architectural heritage, had been reduced to approximately 55 million cubic meters of rubble, and now the Americans, the ones who had delivered this destruction, wanted to help rebuild. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything Frau Weber had been told about Americans during the war years contradicted what she was experiencing in the occupation's early months. The propaganda had been specific and terrifying. Americans were coming to enslave Germany, to starve its people, to exact limitless revenge for German actions during the war. The initial American policies had seemed to confirm these fears. When American forces first entered Germany in large numbers during March and April of 1945, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had issued strict non-fraternization orders, no contact between American soldiers and German civilians except in the course of official business, no handshakes, no conversation, no kindness. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had explicitly forbidden American troops from entering German homes, eating in German restaurants, or speaking with German adults. The policy was meant to impress upon Germans the collective guilt for Nazi crimes and the contempt in which they were held by the civilized world. But the policy had proven impossible to enforce. Young children had crowded around American soldiers begging for candy. Even battle-hardened veterans couldn't resist the children's entreaties and freely distributed chocolate bars and chewing gum from their military rations. German civilians who expected to meet conquering barbarians instead encountered young men from Iowa and Oregon who smiled at them and seemed uncomfortable with the role of stern occupiers. On June 11, 1945, General Eisenhower had lifted the ban on fraternization with German children. 1 month later, in July, he permitted soldiers to engage in conversation with adult Germans on streets and in public places. By September, the non-fraternization policy had been largely abandoned in both Austria and Germany, though prohibitions on marriages between American soldiers and German women remained until December 1946. The shift had been dramatic and swift. A November 1945 survey found that 56% of American soldiers had been talking with German girls during the previous 7 days, 25% for 10 hours or more. But policy changes and casual fraternization were one thing. Organized American assistance to help German civilians rebuild destroyed homes was something else entirely. Something Frau Weber's worldview, shaped by years of Nazi propaganda and months of desperate survival, could barely accommodate. The transformation had begun quietly, driven by several converging forces that German civilians couldn't fully perceive. American occupation officials, initially committed to collective punishment, had begun rethinking their approach by late 1945. The abysmal food and housing situation in occupied Germany was becoming politically embarrassing and strategically problematic. Rations in the British occupation zone, which bordered the American zone where Frau Weber lived, had been reduced to near starvation levels of 1,000 calories per day in March 1946. American zone rations weren't much better, hovering around 1,200 to 1,300 calories daily. For context, food consumption in Britain during the same period, despite continued austerity and rationing, averaged 2,800 calories per day. German civilians were literally starving under Allied occupation. The harsh winter of 1946 to 1947 threatened widespread deaths from malnutrition and exposure, and increasingly, American policymakers recognized that starving Germans could not become the stable, democratic allies that Cold War strategy required. The Soviet Union's increasingly hostile posture toward the West had become impossible to ignore by 1946. The wartime alliance was fracturing rapidly. The Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill described in his Fulton, Missouri speech in March 1946 wasn't metaphorical. It was becoming brutally real in divided Germany. American occupation policy had been codified in Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, issued in April 1945. The directive reflected Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau's punitive vision for Germany. It prohibited economic assistance designed to help the German economy. It restricted agricultural support. It mandated reducing German standards of living to ensure Germany could never again threaten world peace. But by July 1947, JCS 1067 would be repudiated. The directive's prohibition on helping the German economy had become incompatible with American strategic interests. The economic recovery of Europe, American policymakers realized, was dependent on the reactivation of German industry. Long before official policy changed, however, individual American soldiers and administrators had been quietly subverting the punitive approach. Major Ivan Hurst of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers had taken over the Volkswagen plant in Wolfsburg in 1945, initially to make and repair cars for British occupation forces. The Control Commission provided raw materials and labour. Eventually, Hurst would help turn Volkswagen into the automotive giant it is today. The British Army had also mobilised former German soldiers into the German Civil Labour Organisation. By late 1947, over 50,000 Germans were employed as labourers, drivers, mechanics, and in many other roles. They earned wages, they had purpose, they had hope. But Americans went further, much further. On June 5, 1946, the prohibition against sending care packages to occupied Germany was rescinded. The following day, General Lucius D. Clay, military governor of the American occupation zone, signed the CARE Treaty permitting distribution of packages in the American zone. On June 21st, the British signed the treaty as well. CARE, the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe, had been founded in 1945 by 22 American charitable organizations. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Individual Americans could purchase food packages for $10, approximately $143 in today's currency, to be sent to friends, family, or complete strangers in war-torn Europe. The first care packages had arrived in France in May 1946, 15,000 boxes containing desperately needed food. But Germany was different. Germany was the enemy, the aggressor, the nation that had started the war and perpetrated the Holocaust. And yet, by August 1946, the first care packages for distribution in the American zone landed in Bremen harbor. By December, packages were arriving in the French occupation zone. When operations in West Germany ended in 1960, CARE had distributed 83,000 tons of aid. A typical CARE package in 1946 contained items that seemed miraculous to starving Germans. 5 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of lard, 1 pound of sugar, 12 ounces of canned beef, 8 ounces of liver loaf, 8 ounces of bacon, 1 pound of jam, 1 pound of chocolate, 1 can of milk powder. For Germans subsisting on bread and watery soup, these packages represented weeks of normal nutrition delivered in a single box. Renate Center, who received her first care package in 1946 as a 7-year-old refugee from Poland living in the British zone, remembered the moment 70 years later. Her family had fled westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. They had nothing, absolutely nothing to eat, except what the British provided in school meals and occasional loaves of bread shared among the family for an entire week. My mother had a fantastic imagination for how to make things with limited ingredients, Center recalled. I remember she would send me to the railroad tracks to collect coal that had accidentally fallen out. Klaus Putter, a German army chaplain held as a prisoner of war in a French hospital, received a care package and debated for 3 days before opening it. Despite his hunger and desperation, he questioned American motives. Why would Americans send food to former enemies? What did they want in return? Eventually, Putter concluded what millions of Germans would come to believe. Americans are different. They help people in need, regardless of who and where they are. But care packages, while psychologically powerful, were individual gestures. What Frau Weber held in her hand on that March morning in 1946 represented something far more systematic: organized American assistance to help Germans rebuild destroyed homes. The program emerged from converging military, humanitarian, and strategic imperatives. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, appointed Commander-in-Chief and military governor of the British zone, had identified the immediate crisis in May 1945. What to do with 1.5 million German prisoners of war, another million wounded German soldiers, similar numbers of civilian German refugees and displaced persons of many nationalities, no working transport or communication services, industry and agriculture at a standstill, scarcity of food and the risk of starvation and epidemics of disease. Montgomery, a soldier not trained to handle Reconstruction, recognized the magnitude of the problem that confronted the Allies in rebuilding Germany, and as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated through late 1945 and into 1946, the strategic importance of a stable, recovered West Germany became undeniable. The British had launched Operation Barleycorn in summer 1945, releasing over 1 million German soldiers captured and detained during the war's final months to work on the land and bring in the harvest. A similar project, Operation Coal Scuttle, was less successful but demonstrated the principle. Former enemies could become partners in Reconstruction. American engineers had restored much of the transport infrastructure in their occupation zone. Railways were functioning again by late 1945. Roads were being cleared and repaired. The economy had started to revive, though severe shortages of labor and raw materials meant production remained at very low levels. And then came the housing initiatives, not government-mandated programs from Washington or Berlin. The reconstruction of German homes happened locally, organically, driven by German initiative, but increasingly supported by American materials and encouragement. Frau Weber's notification card was part of this emerging system. The American military government had begun allocating surplus construction materials, lumber that had been stockpiled for military purposes but was no longer needed, window glass manufactured in repaired German factories, nails and hardware from American supply depots. The materials weren't free. Germans had to demonstrate need. They had to show they were attempting reconstruction themselves. They had to navigate American bureaucracy conducted in a language most didn't speak. But for those who persisted, the materials came, and with them came something more powerful than lumber and nails. Hope. The psychological transformation from conquered enemy to Reconstruction partner was perhaps the most significant change in occupied Germany during 1946. Frau Weber took her notification card to the American military government office in Stuttgart 3 days later. The building, a former Wehrmacht administration center, now flew American flags. Young American soldiers, most barely 20 years old, directed German civilians through various queues. She waited 4 hours. The bureaucracy was maddening. Forms in English, officials who spoke German but with terrible accents that were difficult to understand, questions about her husband's military service that she answered carefully, honestly, leaving nothing out. Hauptmann Weber had been a career officer. Not a Nazi Party member, but a professional soldier who had served his country. He had died at Kursk, one of approximately 400,000 German casualties in that disastrous battle. Frau Weber had received the notification in August 1943, no body to bury, no grave to visit, just a terse statement that her husband had fallen for the fatherland. She expected the American officials to reject her application. Her husband had been an officer. He had fought against Americans and British and Russians. Why would they help his widow rebuild? Instead, after reviewing her paperwork, a young American lieutenant named Robert Morrison from Minneapolis approved her request. 50 board feet of lumber, 2 panes of window glass, 10 pounds of nails, to be collected from the distribution center within 2 weeks. Lieutenant Morrison spoke in careful, practiced German. "You have small children, Frau Weber?" "My sons are grown," she replied. "Somewhere. I don't know where they are." Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Many families are separated. They may still come home. You will need a house when they do." Frau Weber left the office, clutching her approved forms, tears streaming down her face. The simple humanity of the exchange, the recognition that she might need a home for sons who might return, had broken through months of emotional numbness. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across the American occupation zone during 1946 and 1947. German civilians, particularly widows and families whose men hadn't yet returned from prisoner of war camps, approaching American authorities with desperate requests for help, and increasingly receiving it. The scale of need was overwhelming. In Hamburg, 50% of the city's housing stock had been completely destroyed during the war. Only about 25% remained undamaged. The city faced removing approximately 43 million cubic meters of rubble. Dresden, iconic for the destruction of its historic city centre in February 1945, confronted a similar challenge. Berlin, divided among the 4 occupation powers, lay under an estimated 75 million cubic meters of rubble in the western sectors alone. Clearing this rubble and rebuilding these cities would require decades of sustained effort. But it began immediately, in 1945 and 1946, driven initially by German desperation and increasingly supported by Allied materials and encouragement. The Trümmerfrauen became the iconic symbol of this effort. Women between 15 and 50 years of age, ordered by Allied occupation authorities in 1945 and 1946 to participate in post-war cleanup. With 7 million more women than men in post-war Germany, female labor was essential. They worked in organized columns of 10 to 20, 9-hour workdays with one 20 to 30-minute lunch break, 72 Reichspfennig per hour, and 1 food ration card per day. The ration was very small, and the card could only feed 1 person for a day. Using sledgehammers, picks, buckets, and hand winches, they tore down unsafe building remnants. They formed human chains to transfer bricks to the street, where the bricks were cleaned of mortar and stacked for reuse. Wood and steel beams, fireplaces, wash basins, toilets, pipes, and other household items were collected for reuse. The remaining debris was removed by barrows, wagons, and lorries. Light railways were often constructed to transport rubble to disposal sites. In some cities, Schuttberg, debris mountains, were created from leftover rubble and exist today. The best known is Teufelsberg in Berlin, built over 22 years from debris transported by up to 80 trucks daily. American journalist Margarethe Weber, visiting Berlin in 1945, observed women forming human conveyor belts, passing pails of broken bricks from hand to hand with such slow motion that progress seemed nearly invisible. Yet brick by brick, bucket by bucket, the cities were being cleared. In the Western zones, particularly the American zone, Trümmerfrauen worked for pay. In the Soviet zone, and later the German Democratic Republic, a mixture of full-time workers and weekend volunteers cleared the rubble. Roads were cleared first, then pavements, then the ruined buildings that pockmarked the urban landscape. But recent historical research has complicated the heroic narrative of voluntary Trümmerfrau service. German historian Leonie Traber has documented that many rubble women weren't selfless volunteers serving the nation. Some were former Nazi functionaries ordered to work by the Allies. Others were driven to the rubble mountains by unemployment and hunger. In Berlin, approximately 26,000 women worked as Trümmerfrauen between 1945 and 1948. This was significant, but represented only about 5% of the total female population in that age range. Outside Berlin, particularly in the American zone, most rubble clearing was done by men and machines, not women. In a voluntary recruitment drive in Duisburg in the Ruhr area in December 1945, 10,550 men volunteered. 50 women, the myth of the Trümmerfrau, the cheerful housewife voluntarily clearing rubble to rebuild Germany, was partly Allied propaganda. The authorities showed images of smiling women lugging stones and bricks. The image was repeated so many times it became ingrained in German collective consciousness. But the reality was more complex. Many Trümmerfrauen worked because they had no choice. They needed the wages, however meagre. They needed the food ration cards. They needed purpose and structure in a world that had collapsed around them. What mattered more than the mythology, however, was the reality of Reconstruction. By 1948, substantial progress had been achieved. Rehabilitation varied greatly by city. Stuttgart and Munich were cleaned up rapidly, though not fully reconstructed. Frankfurt and much of the Ruhr were progressing more slowly. Berlin's western sectors were cleaned up quickly, and rehabilitation started immediately. The eastern sectors remained largely uncleared for years, and increasingly, American support shifted from passive tolerance of German reconstruction efforts to active assistance. The transformation from enemy to ally was accelerating. The transformation from punitive occupation to reconstruction partnership accelerated dramatically in 1947. The catalyst was both ideological and practical. The Cold War was no longer a potential future conflict, but a present reality. And starving Germans were becoming security risks rather than appropriately punished former enemies. In early 1946, President Harry S. Truman had controversially reversed earlier policy and permitted food shipments for the German civilian population. Truman also publicly endorsed the Council of Relief Agencies licensed to operate in Germany, known as Kralog, and allowed the organization to solicit charitable donations for German relief. This was politically risky. Many Americans back home worried that leniency toward Germans would dishonor the sacrifices made to defeat Nazi Germany. When American news outlets reported in early May 1945 that high-ranking American officers were regularly socializing with captured Nazi leaders, including Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, public outrage had been intense. But Truman recognized what his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, had been unwilling to acknowledge. Punitive occupation policies were counterproductive. Roosevelt had supported harsh measures, including limits on humanitarian aid, believing soup kitchens were an adequate solution to German food shortages. His Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., had written a memorandum outlining plans for the deindustrialization and partition of Germany. The Morgenthau Plan, though never officially adopted, had influenced Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067. That directive sought a reduction in German standards of living and dictated strict limits on agriculture assistance and industrial production. By 1947, this approach was being systematically dismantled. In July 1947, JCS 1067 was repudiated. Western allies began planning for currency reform to halt rampant inflation. Economic assistance to help the German economy, prohibited under the old directive, became not just permitted, but prioritized. The Marshall Plan, initially known as the European Recovery Program, was initiated in 1947. Secretary of State George C. Marshall announced the program in a speech at Harvard University in June 1947. The purpose was clear: aid the economic recovery of nations after World War II and secure American geopolitical influence over Western Europe. Initially, the Marshall Plan wasn't extended to occupied Germany, but in 1949, after the formation of West Germany from the Western occupation zones, Marshall aid was extended to include the new Federal Republic. Between 1947 and 1952, approximately $13 billion of economic and technical assistance was allocated to Western Europe, roughly $140 billion in 2017 equivalent value. For German widows like Frau Weber, these massive policy shifts translated into tangible changes in daily life. By 1947, the American military government wasn't just permitting German Reconstruction, it was actively facilitating it. Frau Weber used her allocated lumber and window glass to repair her damaged kitchen in April 1946. The work was exhausting. She had to hire a carpenter using money borrowed from her sister, whose husband had survived the war but returned from a Soviet prisoner of war camp, so physically broken he could barely work. The carpenter, Herr Klaus Fischer, was 63 years old, too old to have been conscripted in the war's final desperate months. His hands shook with age and malnutrition, but his skills remained intact. He worked slowly, carefully, transforming the lumber into a functioning wall and ceiling. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Installing the window glass was the transformative moment. For 14 months, Frau Weber had covered the blown-out window opening with boards and scraps of fabric. The kitchen had been dark and cold. Now, light flooded in. She could see her small courtyard, where she was attempting to grow vegetables in soil mixed with brick dust. That evening, she cooked her first meal in the repaired kitchen. Potato soup made from rations and a few salvaged vegetables. The portions were small, the meal was modest, but she ate it in her own kitchen, with walls and a window, and for the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just survival. 6 weeks later, in early June 1946, an unexpected visitor arrived, an American Red Cross worker named Miss Dorothy Brennan from Philadelphia. She spoke adequate German, learned during a year studying in Munich before the war. Miss Brennan was conducting surveys of widow households to assess needs for expanded reconstruction assistance. She carried a clipboard, asked questions about family size, income, housing damage, and available resources. Frau Weber answered honestly, expecting nothing. 3 weeks later, she received another notification card. She was approved for additional materials: roofing materials to repair damaged sections above her bedroom, paint, miraculously, actual paint to cover the smoke-stained walls, and food vouchers that could be exchanged for supplemental rations at the American commissary. The paint was American military surplus, a peculiar shade of olive green that Frau Weber would never have chosen, but it covered the black soot stains from fires that had burned when incendiary bombs struck nearby buildings during the air raids. The walls became clean, uniform, new. Herr Fischer returned to install the roofing materials: tar paper and wooden shingles, not the traditional clay tiles that had covered her roof before the war, but functional and waterproof. When the next rain came, Frau Weber lay in her bed listening to drops hitting the new roof instead of dripping through holes into pans scattered across the floor. She wept. Not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming strangeness of receiving kindness from people who had every reason to hate her and her nation. This pattern repeated across the American occupation zone throughout 1946 and 1947. Individual acts of reconstruction assistance, small in isolation but collectively transforming the relationship between occupied and occupiers. In Munich, widow Helga Schroeder received lumber to rebuild the stairs in her apartment building, which had collapsed during a bombing raid in July 1944. 23 families in the building had been unable to reach upper floors except by ladder for nearly 2 years. American engineers supervised the reconstruction, ensuring structural safety. In Frankfurt, the American military government established workshops where German carpenters could process surplus lumber into standardized building components: window frames, door frames, roof trusses. German workers, many of them former soldiers released from prisoner-of-war camps, earned wages while producing materials that would rebuild their own communities. By late 1947, over 50,000 Germans were employed by the British in their German civil labor organization. The Americans had similar programs. Former enemies were becoming employees, then colleagues, then something approaching partners. The psychological transformation was profound. German civilians who had expected vengeance encountered instead a practical, business-like approach to reconstruction. Americans who had been taught to hate Germans discovered ordinary people trying to survive extraordinary devastation. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, the Minneapolis officer who had approved Frau Weber's initial request, wrote to his wife in August 1946, describing his work. "You wouldn't believe how different these people are from what we expected. They're not monsters. They're not even particularly political, most of them. They're just tired and hungry and trying to rebuild lives that got smashed to pieces." "There's this widow I helped a few months ago," Morrison continued. "Her husband was a German officer, died fighting against us. She has 2 sons missing somewhere, probably dead. And you know what she said when I approved her request? She thanked me and asked God to bless America. I didn't know what to say. This woman, whose husband we killed, whose country we destroyed, thanking us for some lumber and window glass. It makes you think about what we're doing here and why." Morrison wasn't alone in his reassessment. A special envoy sent by President Truman to study German-American relations in December 1945 had concluded that America's punitive policy had disillusioned those Germans who had greeted Americans as liberators. The envoy, Byron Price, pointed out how American soldiers' informal fraternization had made friends among German youngsters. He called the soldiers America's most effective ambassadors of democracy. Far from discouraging fraternization with Germans, Price recommended the military should encourage it. He also pointed to the abysmal food and housing situation, which could only be resolved if America allowed economic reconstruction of the devastated country. For Price, Germans were victims who needed material aid and positive encouragement, not punishment. This view was gaining currency in Washington by 1947. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Privately financed care packages, beginning in 1946, became the mirror of soldiers' informal role as protectors and providers. The government-financed Marshall Plan followed, and finally, the 1948 Berlin airlift became the ultimate demonstration that Americans had accepted Germans needed protection and guardianship rather than punishment. But before these massive programs, individual reconstruction assistance to widows and families was quietly transforming occupied Germany from within. The currency reform of June 1948 brought the first signs of real economic stabilization. The Deutsche Mark replaced the nearly worthless Reichsmark in the Allied Western occupation zones. This ended the black market that had dominated economic life since the war's end, helped stop hyperinflation, and stabilized the economic recovery. For Frau Weber and millions like her, the currency reform meant wages had value again. Savings, though lost in the conversion, could begin accumulating in a currency that meant something. Shops began displaying goods for sale rather than conducting everything through barter and black market exchanges. The transformation was dramatic. One day, store windows were empty. The next day, after currency reform, goods appeared as if by magic. Shopkeepers who had been hoarding merchandise for barter suddenly offered it for Deutsche Marks. The economy, dormant for 3 years, began functioning again. American assistance shifted focus accordingly. Instead of emergency aid, Americans began supporting longer-term reconstruction. Instead of providing surplus materials, Americans helped Germans access credit for purchasing building supplies. Instead of distributing charity, Americans helped establish markets where Germans could buy and sell legitimately. The psychological shift was equally important. Germans were no longer helpless victims awaiting American charity. They were economic actors again, capable of earning, buying, building, and planning for futures beyond mere survival. Frau Weber, now 47 years old, found work in late 1948 as a clerk in the Stuttgart Municipal Housing Office. Her job involved processing reconstruction permits and coordinating with American military government officials on material allocations. She helped other widows navigate the bureaucracy she had once found so intimidating. The irony wasn't lost on her. A German widow, whose husband had died fighting Americans, now worked daily with American occupation personnel to help Germans rebuild homes destroyed by American bombs. The categories that had seemed so absolute in wartime, friend and enemy, victim and aggressor, had become hopelessly blurred in the practical work of reconstruction. In November 1948, an unexpected letter arrived from the International Red Cross. Her younger son, Hans, was alive. He had been held in a Soviet prisoner of war camp since May 1945. He was being released and would return to Germany within approximately 3 weeks. Frau Weber read the letter 5 times before believing it. Hans was alive. After 3.5 years of silence, of assuming both sons were dead, one was coming home. She threw herself into preparing the house. The kitchen was functional. The roof was repaired. But Hans would need a proper bedroom. The room that had been his before the war was barely intact, furniture removed or destroyed, walls damaged. She returned to the American military government office, this time as a professional courtesy visit to Lieutenant Morrison, who had been promoted to captain. She explained the situation. Her son was returning from Soviet captivity. He would need a home. Could she access additional materials to complete the bedroom repairs? Captain Morrison reviewed her records. Frau Weber, you've been working with us for almost 2 years now. You've helped dozens of families get reconstruction assistance. I think we can certainly help you finish your own home. The approved materials went beyond what Frau Weber had requested. Lumber for a bed frame, fabric for mattress ticking, to be stuffed with straw, paint, a small kerosene heater, even a set of basic dishes from American military surplus. Your son fought in the war? Morrison asked carefully. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. He was conscripted in 1944. He was 17 years old. Morrison nodded. He's coming home to a Germany that's very different from the one he left. It will be difficult for him. The military government has counseling services available for returning prisoners of war. Make sure he knows about them. The suggestion that Americans would provide psychological counseling to former German soldiers who had fought against them seemed surreal. But Frau Weber had long since stopped being surprised by American behavior that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught her. Hans arrived on December 9, 1948, 21 years old but looking 40. Emaciated, weighing perhaps 50 kilograms, his face gaunt and aged. He had lost 3 teeth to scurvy. His hands bore frostbite scars. He stood at the door of the rebuilt house, staring at the repaired kitchen, the painted walls, the functional roof, the bedroom prepared for him. Mutti, how did you do all this? He asked. The Americans helped us. Frau Weber replied simply. Hans looked at her with confusion. The Americans? But I fought against Americans. We all did. Why would they help us? Frau Weber had asked herself this question hundreds of times over the past 2.5 years. She had developed an answer, though it still seemed insufficient to explain the enormity of what she had experienced. I think they believe building is better than destroying, she said, and I think they want us to remember who helped us rebuild when we could have been left to die in the rubble. She was right on both counts. American assistance to German reconstruction was partly humanitarian, partly strategic, and partly calculated to win German loyalty in the emerging Cold War. But regardless of motivation, the effect was transformative. Hans slowly recovered his physical health over the following months. The psychological wounds took longer. He suffered nightmares about the Soviet camp. He couldn't tolerate crowds. He flinched at sudden noises. But he was alive, and he was home, sleeping in a bedroom repaired with American materials in a house his mother had rebuilt with American help. In May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed from the three Western occupation zones. The American, British, and French zones merged to create West Germany. The military occupation continued, but increasingly Germans were governing themselves with Allied supervision rather than Allied direct rule. The Marshall Plan was extended to include West Germany in 1949. Massive economic assistance flowed into the new nation. The infrastructure that Americans had helped rebuild in small increments, one widow's kitchen at a time, now received systematic support on a national scale. The economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, the Wirtschaftswunder, was built on foundations laid during 1945 through 1949. The rubble was cleared. The homes were rebuilt. The psychological transformation from enemy to ally was completed. German historian Werner Abelshauser and others have documented that the first stages of German post-war economic recovery actually predated the currency reform of 1948 and the Marshall Plan. The recovery began earlier, driven by German initiative but supported by Allied assistance, particularly in the American zone. The British contribution to German recovery was significant. They provided stability, restored order and rule of law, and secured provision of basic services, even at low levels. They managed some enterprises like Volkswagen that became engines of German economic growth. But American assistance had unique characteristics. Americans didn't just restore stability. They helped Germans rebuild individual homes, family by family, widow by widow. They provided not just macroeconomic assistance, but microeconomic support at the household level. Care packages, home reconstruction materials, employment in Allied labor organizations, access to food beyond starvation rations. These individual interventions, repeated millions of times across the American occupation zone, created personal relationships that transcended official policy. By 1950, when the dismantling of West German heavy industry ended, Germany was already recovering. By 1955, when military occupation of West Germany officially ended, the recovery was well advanced. That same year, West Germany was permitted to join NATO. Former enemies had become formal allies. Frau Weber, now 54 years old, lived to see Germany reunified in 1990. She was 89 years old when the Berlin Wall fell. She had raised her surviving son in the house rebuilt with American help. She had worked for 23 years in the Stuttgart housing office, helping thousands of families access reconstruction assistance. In interviews late in her life, conducted by historians documenting the occupation period, she struggled to articulate what the American assistance had meant. Not just materially, though the lumber and window glass had been essential to survival, but psychologically. "They could have left us to die," she said simply. "Many people thought they should. We had started the war. We had done terrible things. The entire world would have understood if the Americans had simply let us starve in the rubble of our destroyed cities. Instead, they helped us rebuild. They gave us food when we were hungry. They gave us materials when we had nothing. They treated us like human beings when we had been taught they would treat us like animals. I don't think I really understood America until that happened. Their soldiers destroyed our house with their bombs. Then, their soldiers helped me rebuild it. Both actions came from the same country, the same people. That contradiction, that complexity, taught me more about democracy and humanity than any political speech could have." Her son, Hans, who became a teacher and lived until 2003, expressed similar sentiments. "I went to war as a Nazi. I believed the propaganda. I thought Americans were our enemies who wanted to destroy Germany forever. I came home from a Soviet prison camp expecting to find Germany completely destroyed, expecting to be treated as a defeated enemy by occupation forces. Instead, I found Americans helping my mother rebuild our house. Americans offering counseling services to help former German soldiers deal with war trauma. Americans acting like they actually cared whether we lived or died. It didn't make sense at first. Why would victors help the defeated? But that's exactly what they did, and it changed everything, not just for my family, but for all of Germany. The statistics support these individual stories. Germany received approximately $1.4 billion in Marshall Plan assistance between 1948 and 1952. But before the Marshall Plan, Americans had provided assistance through military government programs, care packages, and individual reconstruction support that isn't fully captured in official statistics. By 1960, West Germany had become the third largest economy in the world, behind only the United States and the Soviet Union. The devastated nation of 1945 had become an economic powerhouse within 15 years. This recovery wasn't inevitable. It required German hard work and initiative, but it also required Allied assistance, particularly American support, that helped Germans transform from defeated enemies into prosperous allies. The contrast with East Germany, under Soviet occupation, was stark and became starker over time. While West Germany received Marshall Plan assistance and Allied support for Reconstruction, East Germany paid massive reparations to the Soviet Union. Industrial equipment was dismantled and shipped eastward. Production was redirected to support Soviet needs rather than German recovery. By 1955, West Germans had living standards approaching pre-war levels. East Germans remained impoverished, their economy struggling under Soviet extraction policies. The difference wasn't German character or work ethic. Germans on both sides worked hard to rebuild. The difference was the occupation policy. Western allies, particularly Americans, chose to help Germany rebuild. Soviets chose to extract reparations. The long-term consequences of these different approaches became visible in divided Berlin, where West and East sectors stood in stark physical contrast until reunification in 1990. For German war widows who experienced American Reconstruction assistance, the memory remained powerful throughout their lives. These women, who had lost husbands to Allied military action, found themselves receiving assistance from the very people who had defeated Germany. The cognitive dissonance never entirely resolved. How could the same Americans who dropped bombs that destroyed homes then provide materials to rebuild those homes? How could soldiers from Iowa and Oregon, who had fought to destroy Nazi Germany, then work compassionately with German civilians to help them survive? The answer lay in American pragmatism and the American capacity to shift from total war to generous peace. Americans had waged war ruthlessly, bombing German cities to rubble, demanding unconditional surrender. But once victory was achieved, Americans shifted to Reconstruction with equal determination. This wasn't pure altruism. American policymakers recognized that a prosperous, stable West Germany served American strategic interests in the Cold War. But strategy alone doesn't explain the individual kindness of soldiers like Captain Morrison or Red Cross workers like Miss Brennan. Strategy doesn't explain why Americans bothered to help individual widows repair individual kitchens when macroeconomic programs would have been more efficient. The answer involves American culture, the belief that ordinary people matter, that individual lives are worth saving, that helping one person rebuild one home contributes to rebuilding an entire nation. This micro-level approach to Reconstruction, combined with macro-level Marshall Plan assistance, created the foundation for Germany's recovery. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The German widows who couldn't believe Americans would help them rebuild destroyed homes learned a fundamental lesson about democracy and human nature. People who make war can also make peace. Nations that destroy can also rebuild. Enemies can become allies when approached with generosity rather than vengeance. Frau Margarethe Weber stood in her rebuilt kitchen on March 12, 1956, exactly 10 years after receiving that first notification card. The olive green paint had faded. The window glass had acquired the patina of a decade of use. The lumber showed the wear of years. But the house stood. Her son had married and moved to Frankfurt, where he was teaching history at a gymnasium. She had survived. Germany had survived. And the Americans who had helped her rebuild were no longer occupiers but allies, partners, friends. She pulled out that first notification card from 1946, carefully preserved in a drawer. The English words, translated 10 years earlier by a neighbor's daughter, still promised building materials, lumber, nails, window glass, from Americans. It had been true then. It remained true now. The promise had been kept, the materials had been delivered, the homes had been rebuilt, and Germany, risen from rubble, had become living proof that enemies need not remain enemies forever. That yesterday's destroyers can become today's rebuilders. That war's devastation can be followed by peace's reconstruction. The American soldiers who helped German widows rebuild, destroyed homes probably never realized the full significance of what they were doing. They thought they were just distributing lumber and window glass, just processing paperwork, just doing their jobs in occupied territory. But they were doing something far more important. They were demonstrating that the same nation capable of total war was equally capable of generous peace. They were teaching former enemies that America's power lay not just in destroying what threatened it, but in rebuilding what it had defeated. This lesson, learned by millions of Germans in thousands of individual interactions with American occupation personnel, shaped German-American relations for generations. The memory of American assistance during the darkest years after the war's end created bonds that survived Cold War tensions, diplomatic disagreements, and changing global circumstances. Germany today is America's close ally and partner. That alliance wasn't inevitable in May 1945 when the war ended. It was created deliberately, through policy and practice, through Marshall Plan assistance and individual acts of kindness, through helping war widows rebuild destroyed homes one kitchen at a time. Frau Weber lived until 1998, dying at age 97. She never forgot that morning in March 1946 when she stood in her destroyed kitchen holding a notification card promising American help. She never forgot Captain Morrison approving her requests with kindness and respect. She never forgot Miss Brennan conducting surveys to ensure widows received needed assistance. Most of all, she never forgot that Americans, who had every reason to hate Germany and Germans, chose instead to help rebuild what war had destroyed. That choice changed everything, not just for Frau Weber, not just for her family, but for Germany itself. The widows who couldn't believe Americans would help them learned, through direct experience, that humanity can triumph over hatred, that generosity can follow victory, that yesterday's enemies can become tomorrow's allies. This was America's greatest achievement in occupied Germany, not the billions in Marshall Plan assistance, significant though that was, not the political reorganization or democratic reforms, important though those were, but the transformation of millions of individual Germans from defeated enemies, expecting punishment into partners, in Reconstruction, expecting and receiving assistance. One widow, one kitchen, one notification card, multiplied millions of times across occupied Germany, building not just houses but relationships, creating not just reconstruction but reconciliation, proving that the power to destroy could be matched by the power to rebuild. That was the America-German war widows discovered in the years after 1945, and they never forgot it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.